When we think of the Declaration today, we usually associate it with its famous second paragraph. This is where the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are mentioned, and where the right to abolish a tyrannical government is defended. If we find any section of the Declaration rather tedious, it is likely the list of grievances. This at least is the attitude of someone living in this century. But this was not an attitude typical of someone living during the late 18th century. This person would probably have viewed the list of grievances as the Declaration's most important part, and far more interesting than the second paragraph. If you were an American living in Jefferson's time, the ideas expressed in the second part would have been well known to you. They would have been part of your intellectual culture. Jefferson said these ideas were shared by most of his fellow countrymen. This is why a lengthy defense was unnecessary. The philosophy of the Declaration was accepted by many Americans who opposed independence. The main dispute between defenders and opponents of American independence was not over philosophy. Even the right of revolution against a tyrannical government was upheld by many foes of independence, or loyalists, as they were called. The real bone of contention between revolutionaries and loyalists was whether the relationship between Britain and America had deteriorated far enough to justify revolution. Revolution, Americans agreed, was a last resort. It was warranted only if all other means had failed, and only if no reasonable chance for a peaceful resolution was left. Revolution, in other words, was the last stop of self-defense. The Declaration concedes these requirements. It refers to the patient sufferance of these colonies and to the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. Note the word constrains. Jefferson used words carefully, and nowhere was he more careful than in his choice of this word. Americans were constrained to declare independence. They were compelled by the aggression of England. In every stage of these oppressions, the Declaration says, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. Jefferson portrayed Americans as long-suffering victims of an oppressive king. Indeed, it was widely argued that the king, by defaulting on the duty to protect his subjects, had already made America independent. Jefferson, in his notes of proceedings in the Continental Congress, reported the frequent occurrence of this argument among proponents of independence.
It was urged by J. Adams, Lee, Wythe, and others that the question was not whether, by a declaration of independence, we should make ourselves what we are not, but whether we should declare a fact which already exists. That, as to the king, we had been bound to him by allegiance, but that this bond was now dissolved by his assent to the late Act of Parliament, by which he declares us out of his protection, and by his levying war on us, a fact which had long ago proved us out of his protection, it being a certain position in law that allegiance and protection are reciprocal, the one ceasing when the other is withdrawn. No delegates, then, can be denied or ever want a power of declaring an existent truth.
It is important to understand that there were people of goodwill among both revolutionaries and loyalists. There were also scoundrels on both sides of the fence. How we view our forefathers is influenced by the accidents of history. If England had won the war, and given some better decisions, there's no reason why the most powerful military force in the world could not have defeated America, then our school books might read much differently than they do now. Benedict Arnold might be celebrated as the savior of his country, and George Washington might be condemned as a villainous traitor. Because both revolutionaries and loyalists shared a similar philosophy, the Declaration devotes its firepower to factual considerations. Those Americans uncommitted to independence did not need to be lectured on natural rights and the proper function of government. They probably agreed with the revolutionaries on these points already. But fence-sitters and loyalists did need to be persuaded that the time had come when revolution was absolutely necessary to preserve liberty. Consider the interesting case of a New York loyalist, Peter Van Schaack. In January 1776, Van Schaack secluded himself for an extended period of study. He read or reread the political works admired by 18th century Americans in a tormented effort to determine where his loyalty should lie in the coming storm with England. Van Schack's basic philosophy was indistinguishable from pro-independence radicals. He too believed in a right of revolution, and he too denied parliamentary sovereignty. But Van Schaack was not convinced that the aggressions of the mother country added up to a conspiracy. He, unlike Jefferson, did not believe there existed a definite plan to enslave America. Therefore, Peter Van Schaack could not side with the revolutionaries, however much he agreed with their ideology.
My difficulty arises from this, that taking the whole of the acts complained of together, they do not, I think, manifest a system of slavery, but may fairly be imputed to human frailty and the difficulty of the subject. Most of them seem to have sprung out of particular occasions and are unconnected with each other. In short, I think those acts may have been passed without a preconcerted plan of enslaving us, and it appears to me that the more favorable construction ought ever to be put on the conduct of our rulers. I cannot, therefore, think the government dissolved.
Peter Van Schaack tried to remain neutral during the war with England, but to no avail. The state of New York enforced compulsory loyalty oaths, but Van Schaack, following his conscience, could not comply. He was banished to England in 1778 and did not return to America for 7 years. Peter Van Schaack and many other loyalists were on the wrong side of the war. They suffered, not because they differed with the revolutionaries over theory, but because they differed with the revolutionaries over facts. For these people, the grievances listed in the Declaration easily constituted its most significant part. That was the 18th century's perspective. But here we are, 200 years later, looking back on the lost world of Thomas Jefferson. The thinking behind the Declaration is no longer so obvious to us. We need to understand the mindset of remarkable Americans like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and others. We want to know the values and ideas which motivated them to revolt against a mighty imperial power. This is why the ideas contained in the second paragraph receive more attention today than the list of grievances. The second paragraph, probably the most famous paragraph in the history of American literature, allows us to peer into the minds of the Founding Fathers. When it came to political theory, Thomas Jefferson was one of the best-read delegates at the Second Continental Congress. This is part of the reason he was chosen to write the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson freely acknowledged the writers who influenced him, and many of these fall into what he called the Whig tradition. Whig, as you may know, was the name of a political party in England. But this is not what Jefferson meant by Whig. He meant not a party, but a political tradition originating in England around the 1640s. This decade saw growing opposition to absolute monarchy, leading to the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I in 1649, and the establishment of a short-lived Commonwealth. Jefferson subscribed to the basic principles of this tradition, including natural rights, social contract, the right of revolution, and a separation of governmental powers. These ideas were refined by English writers during the 1680s, and they became especially popular after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which displaced the Stuart dynasty from the throne of England. The premier writer in this tradition was John Locke, who wrote his famous Second Treatise of Government during the 1680s. Another hero to Jefferson was Algernon Sidney, whose book Discourses Concerning Government was regarded by many Americans as a textbook of revolution. Sidney was called Sidney the Martyr because he died on the scaffold in 1683, executed by the English government for sedition. Names like Algernon Sidney may be unknown today, but they were revered by 18th century Americans. The last will and testament of Josiah Quincy demonstrates how our revolutionary forefathers wished to pass on their intellectual heritage to future generations.
I leave to my son, when he shall have reached the age of 15, the works of Algernon Sidney, John Locke, Bacon, Gordon's Tacitus, and Cato's Letters. May the spirit of liberty rest upon him.
In 1825, Jefferson urged the Board of Visitors of the University of Virginia to acknowledge those books on which the American Republic was founded.
Resolve that it is the opinion of this board that as to the general principles of liberty and the rights of man, in nature and in society, the doctrines of Locke, in his essay concerning the true original extent and end of civil government, and of Sidney in his Discourses on Government, may be considered as those generally approved by our fellow citizens of Virginia and the United States.
If you were to read Locke or Sidney today, You might find them dry and dull, and you might wonder how earlier generations could get so excited about them. You should understand that these writers vigorously defend the right, and in Sidney's case, the duty, to revolt against tyrannical governments. The abstract theories of Locke and Sidney have dramatic effects when applied to the real world. The danger of Sidney's discourses concerning government was summarized by Judge Jeffreys during the Sidney trial for sedition in 1683.
This book contains all the malice and revenge and treason that mankind can be guilty of. It fixes the sole power in the Parliament and the people. The king, it says, is responsible to them. The king is but their trustee. That he had betrayed his trust, he had misgoverned, and now he is to give up, that they might all be kings themselves. Gentlemen, I must tell you I think I ought more than ordinarily to press this upon you, because I know the misfortune of the late unhappy rebellion, and the bringing of the late blessed king to the scaffold was begun by such kind of principles.
Thomas Jefferson admired the works of John Locke, Algernon Sidney, and other Whig writers. We should mention, however, that modern scholars do not follow Jefferson in referring to this simply as the Whig tradition. To do so would confuse radicals like Locke and Sidney with more conservative thinkers who call themselves Whigs. Consequently, Jefferson's way of thinking is sometimes called the true Whig or the radical Whig philosophy. Jefferson believed that many Americans embraced true Whig ideology, and he wished the Declaration to express this general point of view.
This was the object of the Declaration of Independence, not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject, in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent, and to justify ourselves in the independent stand we are compelled to take. Neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing, it was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. All its authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversation, in letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public right, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc.
An essential part of this radical Whig tradition was its defense of the right of revolution. The Declaration of Independence, remember, is nothing less than a justification of revolution against an established government. The signers of the Declaration knew they might share the disastrous fate of Algernon Sidney. John Locke discusses the right of revolution in his second treatise, and the influence of this treatment on Jefferson is unmistakable. Even Jefferson's choice of words often reflects the work by Locke, written a century before. To illustrate this point, we shall compare a few passages from the Declaration with similar passages from John Locke. Here is Jefferson.
Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
And here is Locke.
When the government is dissolved, the people are at liberty to provide for themselves, by erecting a new legislative, differing from the other, by the change of persons, or form, or both, as they shall find it most for their safety and good.
Here again is Jefferson.
Mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed.
And here again is Locke.
People are more disposed to suffer than right themselves by resistance.
Here is Jefferson.
But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security.
And here is Locke.
But if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending the same way, make the design visible to the people, 'tis not to be wondered that they should then rouse themselves and endeavor to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the ends for which government was first erected.
We can see that Jefferson was influenced by John Locke's theory of revolution. But neither Locke nor Jefferson regarded the right of revolution as a primary principle. It was based on and presupposed the concepts of natural rights and social contract. Jefferson and other radical Whigs believed that human beings have natural rights. Natural rights are rights we are born with, rights we enjoy in virtue of our nature as human beings. These rights do not rely for their validity on any person or government, and no person or government can legitimately violate them or take them from us. Natural rights seem so obvious to many 18th century Americans that the Declaration calls them self-evident.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
You may have noticed that although we usually say inalienable rights spelled with an I, the Declaration speaks of unalienable rights spelled with a U. Does this difference reflect a subtle change in meaning? Most likely not. It probably reflects what we call today a typographical error. Jefferson used the word inalienable in his original draft. Where and how the I became a U is anyone's guess. If men are born with equal rights, then how do some men acquire legitimate political power over other men? Jefferson says that individuals put themselves under government voluntarily in order to secure their rights. This is the classic justification of government known as the social contract, and it defines the limits beyond which government may not cross.
That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
If the protection of rights is the proper function of government, then what happens if a government oversteps this line? Jefferson says that if a government oversteps far enough and often enough, that is, if it becomes oppressive, then that government may be abolished and a new government put in its place. Notice how Jefferson defends the right of revolution against any form of government, so long as that government has sufficiently degenerated into tyranny.
That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
This was the right of revolution championed by Jefferson and other radical Whigs. Having inspired the American Revolution and later the French Revolution, this was the revolutionary doctrine of the 18th century. This was the doctrine condemned vehemently by its opponents as the road to anarchy. Although radical Whigs defended revolution, they by no means defended it without qualification. They did not approve of indiscriminate revolution. They insisted that preconditions must be satisfied before revolution is called for. No government is perfect, so there would be perpetual turmoil if revolutions broke out at the slightest injustice. Isolated cases of oppression might justify resistance, but they cannot justify revolution. The rule of thumb here is that revolutions should not create more evils than they remedy.
Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed.
The abstract right of revolution is clear, but to apply this principle to the real world requires great care. Of capital importance to the radical Whigs was the presence of a conspiracy by government to subvert human liberty. Unrelated acts of injustice were not enough. These acts must link together in a causal chain, thereby providing evidence of a plan. The established government must exhibit a design, a purposely thought-out series of events to establish tyranny. Only after this pattern of injustice becomes evident to enough people can a revolution be justified in self-defense.
But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security.
Jefferson set out to prove that George III was guilty of a conspiracy to subvert the liberties of America. He wished to show that aggressive acts by the English government were not unrelated incidents. When colonial grievances dating from 1763 were placed in a larger picture and linked together, Jefferson believed they uncovered a diabolical march to tyranny.
Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
And so Jefferson presented his allegations against George III. As we said before, these were not offered as a grab bag of unrelated crimes. Their persistence and sheer numbers would, Jefferson hoped, provide conclusive evidence of a tyrannical plan to enslave America. Some historians dismissed Jefferson's argument out of hand. George III, they say, had his faults, but he was no tyrant. In their opinion, Jefferson's charge of tyranny was politically motivated propaganda. Before dismissing Jefferson as a political hack, however, we should try to understand his use of words. Two important words appear in the Declaration: usurpation and tyranny. Jefferson uses these words with different meanings. He refers to a long train of abuses and usurpations leading to despotism, and he goes on to use usurpation and tyranny in the same sentence.
The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states.
Repeated usurpations, Jefferson says, indicate a plan to establish tyranny. This suggests that tyranny is worse than usurpation. It is a more serious kind of oppression. Now, we don't use the words tyranny and usurpation much anymore, but they were common in Jefferson's time. Significantly, Jefferson means different things by them, but nowhere, in or out of the Declaration, does he explain this difference. This suggests that Jefferson assumed his audience would know the difference. Where would they have learned such a thing? Perhaps in a book known to most educated readers of Jefferson's day, a book we cited previously to show its impact on Jefferson's thinking. This book is John Locke's second treatise of government. Recall that Jefferson's treatment of revolution drew heavily from John Locke. The passages we quoted from Locke's second treatise, passages Jefferson undoubtedly read, are located near Locke's discussion of tyranny. Locke uses the word tyranny with a specific meaning. And, as you may have guessed, Locke contrasts the meaning of tyranny with the meaning of usurpation. Here is the key passage from Locke. It is brief, and its meaning is not obvious. For this reason, we shall repeat the passage later.
As usurpation is the exercise of power which another hath a right to, so tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right, which nobody can have a right to.
Locke's distinction is difficult to understand, because it depends on a theory of rights. So let's take a quick look at his approach to rights, and then return to his passage about tyranny. John Locke, like Jefferson and others in their tradition, believed in two kinds of rights: alienable rights and inalienable rights. What are alienable rights? They are rights that can be abandoned or transferred. When you sell your car, for example, you transfer the title of ownership to another person. This means the right to your car was alienable. You had the power, with your consent, of abandoning or transferring the title to your car. What are inalienable rights? They are rights that cannot be abandoned or transferred under any circumstances. Radical Whigs generally accepted the rights to life and liberty as inalienable rights. You cannot, according to their theory, transfer the title to your life and liberty as you would transfer the title to your car. You cannot sell yourself into slavery, and this holds true whether or not you consent, because there is no title to life and liberty that is even capable of transfer. Inalienable rights derive from your nature as a human being, and they cannot be separated from it. The distinction between alienable rights and inalienable rights was very important for philosophers who believed that a social contract bound a person to his government. They believed that a person surrendered some rights to government in exchange for the government's protection of other rights. For example, a person was said to surrender the right to a minimal amount of alienable property collected as taxes, which the government required for its expenses. Now, this supposed agreement between the people and government never actually happened, and most social contract philosophers knew it. They did not believe in a real agreement located somewhere in the past, or more precisely, they did not believe in the historical reality of an explicit agreement based on the explicit consent of every person. To get their social contract off the ground, these philosophers appealed to what they called implied or tacit consent. This is the kind of agreement you give to pay your bill at a restaurant, for example, without stating beforehand your agreement to pay the bill. Your consent is seen as implicit in your actions. This raises a serious problem. If a social contract is implied by our actions, if the exact terms of the social contract are unstated and uncertain, then how can we know if a government violates its part of the agreement? Even an oppressive government can fall back on the social contract. Even an oppressive government can say its actions do not violate rights because the rights in question were surrendered as part of the social contract. This uncertainty creates a sticky problem for the social contract argument. The social contract, it seems, instead of justifying revolution, will always condemn it. This is inevitable if no limit is set on the rights supposedly surrendered or transferred to government in the unwritten and undefined social contract. The social contract advocates replied with an appeal to inalienable rights. These rights are impossible to surrender or transfer. Clearly, then, the previous excuse used by governments will never work with inalienable rights. We know inalienable rights were never transferred to any government in the social contract, because they never can be transferred to anyone at any time under any circumstances. Inalienable rights stand outside any social contract, real or imaginary. They establish an inflexible barrier beyond which no government may pass. With this background, listen once more to Locke's definition of tyranny.
As usurpation is the exercise of power which another hath a right to, so tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right, which nobody can have a right to.
Locke's distinction should now be clear. Usurpation refers to violating alienable rights. Tyranny refers to violating inalienable rights. Stealing a car is usurpation. Enslaving a man is tyranny. If Jefferson was familiar with Locke's definition of tyranny, and it seems certain he was, then Jefferson's reasoning in the Declaration becomes more understandable. Jefferson's overriding purpose in the Declaration was to convict the king of tyranny. So how did Jefferson begin? Logically enough, with a list of inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the rights which, if violated by the king, would make him a tyrant. Jefferson knew what he was doing. American colonists had complained for years about the usurpations of the English Parliament and later the English king. Jefferson himself accused Parliament and king of usurpation in his 1774 pamphlet, A Summary View of the Rights of British America. So long as the complaints went no further than usurpation, however, the colonists were in the same dilemma we discussed earlier. The rights they complained about were alienable rights, so who was to say whether or not these rights were surrendered in a mythical social contract? One thing was certain. No revolution would ever get off the philosophic starting blocks in the midst of this confusion. If Jefferson was to justify revolution, he had to convict George III of violating not just any rights, but of violating inalienable rights. This was necessary for two reasons. First, there was no possible excuse for a systematic violation of inalienable rights. The argument quoted earlier from the loyalist Peter von Schaack, which said Americans should give England the benefit of the doubt, might work with alienable rights, but not with inalienable rights. Neither the Parliament nor the King could deceive themselves into thinking that inalienable rights had somehow been surrendered by Americans in a social contract or by any other means. No, only one possible motive explained the repeated violation of inalienable rights: a deliberate plan to establish tyranny. Second, if the king could be proved guilty of violating inalienable rights, then the charge of tyranny, as defined by Locke, would stick. And when usurpation turns into tyranny, resistance can legitimately turn into revolution. When we focus on Jefferson's charge of tyranny against George III, and when we realize that tyranny was defined as the violation of inalienable rights, the Declaration of Independence appears as a systematic and tightly argued document. Listen to the second paragraph once again, but this time hear it as a contemporary of Jefferson would have heard it. Listen as one who advocates the right of revolution, but only if a conspiracy to establish tyranny is proven against the king. That is, only if enough evidence is presented to show the purposeful violation of inalienable rights.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
Throughout his eventful life, Thomas Jefferson regarded the Declaration of Independence as one of his greatest achievements. In 1826, Jefferson wrote his own epitaph. The Declaration was one of the 3 accomplishments he wished to be remembered for.
Could the dead feel any interest in monuments or other remembrances of them, the following would be to me the most gratifying. The following inscription and not a word more. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Because by these, as testimonials that I have lived, I wish most to be remembered.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation of the Declaration of Independence from the Audio Classics series by Knowledge Products. This continuing series of cassettes presents the major ideas of great thinkers with a discussion of their historical and intellectual context. The script for the Declaration of Independence is by George H. Smith. Narration is by Craig Deitschman. Voice characterizations are by Bill Middleton. This material may not be copied in whole or in part without the permission of the copyright owner. Copyright 1985, Carmichael & Carmichael Incorporated.